Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting soon. Let's give everyone a moment to join into the meeting before we begin. I'm being told that people are flying in, so we're at about 105 people who've joined. We're going to give everyone a couple of minutes more to join before we begin. Thank you. I can see people chatting with each other. It's really nice. Please do participate and say hello to each other. Lots of lively discussion saying hello and where you're from. Wow, we've got people from everywhere. We've got people from Munich, from London, Italy, South Africa, Spain, Stockholm, Brazil, Jakarta, Germany, Stockholm, Sweden, India, Thailand, Malaysia, Belgium, Singapore, of course, Canada. Welcome, everybody. So for those of you who have just joined, good afternoon. We'll be starting soon. We're just going to give everyone a moment to join into the meeting before we start, probably in about 1 minute's time. We're up to 198 in participation at the moment. We've got someone from Australia, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Sydney. Such a wonderful turnout. It's really, really, really lovely to see everyone. Okay, so it's 3:35 and we will begin. Good afternoon and thank you all for finding time to attend today's webinar. So this is Natasha here and I'm the Head of Strategic Marketing and Experience at HCLI. The Human Capital Leadership Institute is a center for excellence that develops leaders in Asia for Asia. The Institute achieves this by driving Asia-specific research and insights, creating industry-relevant executive development programs, and fostering rich networks between thought leaders in business, government, and academia. Thank you so much to everyone here for taking time out and being here today. This is really exciting. We have a turnout of over 200 people from all over the world attending this webinar today. And thank you so much for taking time and being here again. So quick note on housekeeping. Let me explain to you how you can talk to us during the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please click on where it says Q&A and type that into the window, because this is the only place where questions will appear to us and not the chat window. Now, this is the first in four webinars in a series titled Hitting Reset, Designing the Next Normal, organized by HCLI and our partners, The Edge, IDC, KPI Soft, the Social Capital Institute, and SP Jain School of Global Management. Today's session is Leading Through Complexity and Chaos. We're honored to have Dave Snowden here with us today to share his wisdom and insights. Dave, we're so very grateful to you for giving us your time today. You have been a forerunner in knowledge management and the application of complexity science, which is now more than ever essential considering the severity of the state that COVID-19 has put us in globally. At HCLI, we find the Cynefin framework especially helpful for guiding decision-making in complex environments, and we have embedded it in a number of our upcoming core leadership development programs. We are also very grateful to our panelists, industry professionals, Deepak Ohri, Jesko von den Steinen, and Tong Yi, for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here. Thank you. I will give you a deeper introduction after the first segment of the webinar. Now, our panelists will discuss how the insights from Dave's session can be directly applied to their immediate challenges and share their views on how leaders could lead and, more importantly, find opportunities and navigate through these trying times. So the agenda for the rest of the 80 minutes or so will follow accordingly. We will be running a virtual session or a virtual version of Cognitive Edge's Tricopticon method, where the whole process is designed to integrate and build a theory-informed practice base. So for about 30 minutes, Dave will speak on the topic with panelists listening in on the conversation. Dave will then sit aside, and for the next 20 to 25 minutes, our panelists, the practitioners, will come in together to reflect on what they heard and how they might apply the thinking that Dave has outlined, with Dave listening in. And after that, Dave joins the panelists and reflects on how the practitioners interpreted and reacted to his ideas. And at this point, we might also bring in some questions from the audience where appropriate. We'll then open the floor for questions and comments, and then conclude and close. My team and I will send you all the relevant links after the event, including a link to the webinar recording should you wish to watch it afterwards. Now, we know that everyone is dialing in from all over the world, so in case of bad connection, we will start live subtitling the session. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Dave Snowden. Dave is the founder and chief scientific officer of Cognitive Edge, which is headquartered here in Singapore, where they enjoy a close partnership with the Singapore government. Dave is the inventor of the Cynefin framework. His work is highly revered, and his publication in the HBR is one of the most widely cited works of all time. Today, Dave will talk about Cynefin, leadership and organizational structure, and give us a sneak peek into a field guide on managing crisis and uncertainty, which he's developing with the European Commission. He will go into practical steps for crisis recovery and ways to survive, exploit, and transcend crisis. Please let us put our hands together for a virtual round of applause to welcome Dave. Over to you, Dave.
Mute myself. Okay, so can I just double check everybody can see me, and you need to allow me to share screen. Okay. Right. Okay, so I sorted out now. I should be getting used to Zoom by now, having spent so many hours on it over the last few weeks. I want to do this in three sections. Firstly, I want to introduce three core scientific concepts. The work I pioneered started in IBM and then also within Cognitive Edge after I left IBM, partly in the request of the Singapore government, but that's a long story, was to apply natural science to social systems. One of the reasons for doing that is that the sort of case-based approach, which is the traditional approach to management science, go and study things that you consider successful or consider failure and try and imitate or copy those, has some utility in highly stable conditions, but actually has very little utility in times of radical change. The last thing you want to be doing is follow the practice of who was successful in the previous era when the new era is about to be very different. And if you look at the companies who we study and praise these days, like Apple, like General Electric and so on, they're companies who actually didn't copy what other people had done before. They did something original. And one of the ways you reduce uncertainty is to fall back to natural science. So that's the basic core concept here. So the first thing I want to talk about is complexity theory. This is starting to become highly topical, which means there's lots of bad books and lots of good books and lots of papers. A basic metaphor which Alicia Gerraro created to understand a complex system is a phrase like bramble bushes in a thicket, which is a lovely phrase. I mean, this is a bramble bush, it produces wonderful fruit. But if you actually go into a small wood with lots of bramble bushes, everything is entangled. And the concept of entanglement is key to understanding complexity theory. If you tug one branch, you don't know what will happen elsewhere in the thicket. And you can't take the thing apart and put it back together again. Everything is interconnected in ways that you don't know and can't discover, but it still produces fruit. So that concept of entanglement is key. And that has consequences for management. I mean, this is from a paper that Cynthia and I wrote some years ago, where we looked into the etymology of the word manage in English, which comes originally from the Italian managere. My pronunciation is terrible, so other people can correct that, which is the ability to ride a horse in a form of dressage, where effectively you've got and another key complexity phrase, the horse and the rider have to co-evolve. You can't just issue instructions, you have to be part of a constant interaction of mutual learning. You may be in charge, but the horse has something to say around that. In the early 18th century, it got fused in with the French term to manage a household budget. And part of the problem we got at the moment is managers are trained in the French meaning rather than the Italian meaning. So part of what I want to argue as we go through this is we need to return to thinking about this co-evolution between managers, leaders, their employees, their markets, their customers. It's not something where you can predict or plan or can direct. And if you really want the summary of what complexity is about, and this is a scary thing about it, is that it's fundamentally about systems which have no meaningful relationship between cause and effect. So the same thing will never happen again the same way twice except by accident. But with the benefit of hindsight, something called retrospective coherence, you'll always be able to pretend there was a cause and effect relationship. And this is the big issue. If you look at the two shuttle disaster reports, if you look at the 9/11 report in the States, with the benefit of hindsight, everybody can tell you what people should have done. But if the system is complex, hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. You have to manage in the present, you have to see what's possible. So the key thing about complexity is it has propensities. So there are things that you can understand about it, which are more rather than less likely. And it has dispositional states, i.e. whether it's stable or turbulent or close to turbulence, which you can measure and predict. So it's not that we can't manage it, but it's more like that riding a horse than it is a household budget. So that's key science point number one. Next one is from cognitive neuroscience, and this is kind of like significantly scary, particularly if you're going into hospital in the current crisis. And this experiment has been repeated in many different ways with different people. So you take a group of radiologists and ask them to look for anomalies in a set of x-rays. And on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of the average cancer nodule. On average, 83% don't see it, even though their eyes actually physically scanned it. And the scary thing is the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who did. And this is the big area that I've worked on most of my life, which is called weak signal detection. Yeah, after the gorilla has come out and hit you, you might sort of realize retrospectively you should have seen it. But the fact is you don't see what you don't expect to see. Okay? Now, I can't overemphasize this. This is not something you can be trained not to do. The only people who always see the gorilla are fully autistic. And because they scan everything and they objectively assess everything, but of course they can't operate in the real world. The reality of the human condition is that in general, you will not see what you do not expect to see. Yeah, you're not being ignorant and you're not being stupid, you just haven't seen it. So one of the key things in complexity, and this is something we call mass sense, is to engage large networks of people from different backgrounds, cultural, experiential, ethnic, whatever, to do situational assessment in near real time, so that you can find the clusters and groups of people who've seen something which the rest of you need to pay attention to. And I'll come back to that later, but that's something called mass sense. But what I'm building here is a picture. From a complexity point of view, nothing is certain, everything is ambiguous, but there are things that you can manage. From a cognitive point of view, you will only see the expected unless it's right in your face, and even then it will be difficult. So you have to work with that, against it, not against it. And the third thing is key to understanding innovation. And this is a biological process called exaptation. So adaptation, we're all familiar with from evolutionary theory. And I've given an example here of a dinosaur fossil. Dinosaurs evolved and adapted over time. And we know from the discoveries in northern China that all dinosaurs had feathers, and the feathers were very colorful. So the evolutionary driver for feathers is actual sexual display. And then a group of dinosaurs developed skin flaps on their forelimbs, effectively to better do the sexual display, and they had lots of feathers. And those dinosaurs, when they fell off cliffs, glided. And that's how we got flight. So a trait which evolved for one function under conditions of stress exapts for something completely different. So adaptation is linear, exaptation is non-linear. Right? The other one I love from biology is the cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to do fine-grained manipulation of muscles in fingers. But in humans, it exapts to manage grammar in language. So the huge sophistication of grammar was just too much to happen in a linear way. It required a non-linear repurposing. If you think that's not relevant to today, then the entire pharmaceutical industry relies on this. It relies on people notice anomalies. Yeah, the famous one is Viagra. Somebody notices a side effect of a drug developed for one purpose, and it becomes a blockbusting drug. Thalidomide, originally developed for pain relief, has two side effects. One produced deformed children, the other produced the first ever cure for leprosy. So the pharmaceutical industry is heavily dependent on exaptation. In 1945, a Raytheon engineer noticed that a chocolate bar had melted in his pocket while he was maintaining the magneto of a radar machine. Now, lots of engineers had noticed this, and they'd mainly sworn and had their trousers cleaned. He realized the significance, and from that we got microwave ovens. The history of radical innovation is the history of what we also call radical repurposing. The ability to take something you're already highly credible in, that you have knowledge of, and use it for something novel. Another example, IBM, who dominated the IT industry for many years, repurposed punch cards, which they were the experts in, to control sewing machines. Yeah, and actually from that, the whole growth of computing came. So managing for serendipity, managing for exaptation, managing for radical repurposing is key In a crisis, the opportunities for it increase greatly. If you actually think of innovation during the war, we're more able to repurpose quite quickly. So 3 things: complexity, inattentional blindness, and exaptation are 3 key things from science that we need to apply. Now that leads me into the Cynefin framework. And the general approach here, and this is my definition of sense making, is how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it? And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. Yeah, it's when do I know that I know enough to take an action or to know the nature of the action I should take. So that's kind of like one of the bases of this. The other origin is, and I was a general manager for many years of my life. I was a strategy director. I worked in charity for 4 or 5 years after university. I've run my own company. I've done 3 software startups now, 2 within large organizations, 1 within my own. And one of the things that really frustrated me over the years is the fad cycle of management theory. So you get this massive attempt, and it would be rolled up by the big consultancies: business process reengineering, blue ocean strategy, learning organization, agile, all of these things. Yeah, each one of them claim to be effectively a magic solution. Yeah, if you adopt this, all your problems will be solved. Everything you've done before is a waste of time. You need to start again. This is the new process. This is the new approach. And I've seen multiple cycles of that over the last few decades. And part of my frustration here, and it actually goes back to when I studied philosophy at university, was, hang on a minute, this stuff works, but it works within boundaries. Yeah, we've been using this idea or this method for a period of time, and we got a huge benefit from it. But we don't now need to abandon it because we've discovered circumstances where it doesn't work. We need to create a boundary to say it works to this point. So things like business process reengineering and Six Sigma work really well in highly structured systems with repeating relationships between cause and effect. But they work really badly when the system shifts from order to complex, where you've got high levels of uncertainty. So they're poor in customer services, brilliant in manufacturing, and so on. So this is the concept of bounded applicability. So what Cynefin does, and it's evolved over the years, is it identifies 5 domains or states. The first is where the relationship between cause and effect is clear to any reasonable person. So in the UK, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In America, they drive on the right-hand side of the road. The decision model is very quickly, where am I? It's one of the countries which drives on the right, so I'll follow accordingly. I sense, I categorize, respond. I can apply best practice, and the constraint structure, and we're going to come back to constraints, is fixed, it's rigid. Yeah, there's no ambiguity about this. You drive on the left, you drive on the right. And there's a whole body of practice in organizations which fits into that category. The second one is where there is a repeating relationship between cause and effect, but it's complicated, not clear. That means it may be clear or obvious to an expert, but not to the decision maker. So at this point, we can't just categorize things. We've got to do some sort of analysis or investigation. So here we sense, we analyze, respond, and we have what are called governing constraints rather than fixed constraints. So we allow a degree of ambiguity. If you've passed the tests, you've passed the exams, you've done the service to be a surgeon, you shouldn't be forced to always do things one way. And actually, we don't do that. We have good practice, not bad practice. And I was in hospital for an operation in December. I had a brain bleed, partly as a result of living in a thatched cottage with low roofs, and partly as a result of falling on a mountain. And so they had to drill 2 holes in my skull to get the blood out. Now, it's quite interesting. I was delayed on the operation by about half a day because of a crisis came in on the air ambulance. And the surgeon who was going to operate would have put a drainage tube into the skull. And the surgeon the next day who did operate didn't do that. There were different practices and they had different reasons for it. Okay? Now, that variation is quite important because there's an element of judgment within the process. Okay? So good practice and best practice aren't the same thing. Yeah? But within good practice, there are governing constraints, there are limits around which you allow variety. Whereas with fixed constraints, it's not limits, everything is tightly connected. Now, if you get that wrong and you over-constrain a system, you make it too rigid, you don't allow for variation, then you get a collapse into chaos. The bottom boundary on Cynefin is actually shown as a cliff, that's the wiggle at the bottom. So you plummet into a crisis, and COVID is an example of what's called a black elephant. So it's a mixture of Taleb's idea of the black swan, a sudden surprise, and an elephant in the room, because we all knew it could happen, we just didn't want to take the costs of planning for it. So that's the black elephant. Yeah. So when that happened, it plunged whole countries into crisis. And at that point, your response is to act, sense, respond. You have to act decisively to create some sort of pattern or structure. There are no constraints, everything is open. I mean, up until a few months ago, there was a wonderful phrase from a British Prime Minister. She said, there are no magic money trees, i.e. money is a constraint. Well, at the moment, governments around the world are planting magic money forests because with COVID, there's no constraint. So the constraints have just disappeared for a period. They'll come back, but the constraints vanish. And therefore, there's nothing so good as a crisis to create novelty. And the one thing we know from crises is that new predators or new dominant players emerge. Right? So when the meteor hits the earth and wipes out the dinosaurs, it's not the shark or the crocodile who dominate thereafter, it's the mammals, because they're small and energy efficient and they can adapt very quickly. If you look at what's happening in COVID, small countries like South Korea, Senegal and others have actually come out of the crisis faster because they didn't have the resources of the UK and the US, for example, which in theory were better prepared. And they're actually potentially going to be a safer place for people to invest because they've got the disease vector under control. So we're going to see some major changes coming. And that always happens with a crisis. And remember cognitive bias, or rather inattentional blindness. The danger is you won't see them, particularly if you're a very large organization which has been very successful. You're less likely to see novelty than an organization which has failed. I said years ago, starvation, pressure, and perspective shift are the key conditions for innovation. It's not about creativity or resourcing. We're innovative in a crisis, but not otherwise. And then we get complexity. In a complex system, you have to probe, and all executives have faced this. A situation where they've got, 5 or 6 different hypotheses about what they should do. And those hypotheses contradict each other and they've got to make a decision. And there isn't enough evidence to make a decision on an evidence base within the time frame for the decision. That's the definition of complexity. You have competing hypotheses about what you should do, and you can't make a decision on an evidence base within the time frame available. So under those circumstances, you don't actually bother. Each hypothesis gets a small amount of resource to do a safe to fail experiment, and you see what happens. It's unlikely any of the experiments will succeed, but the way that they partially succeed or partially fail will create structure in the space so you can know what to do. And it's in the complex domain where you do exaptive practice. You focus on radical repurposing. You haven't got time to invent from scratch, so you have to find out what you're good at and find ways to reuse it very quickly. And there are lots and lots of examples of that in COVID, if you look around at the moment. So the central domain, or the fifth domain, is, at the simplest level, is confused. It's a state of not knowing which of those domains you're in, at which point you'll do whatever you feel more comfortable. Now, you might be aware of that confusion, at which point there's things you can do, or you might be unaware of it. That's the AC type element. So that's the Cynefin framework. If you search for it on Google Scholar, you'll find it's been used for everything from military decision-making. It was used by the US Army in Afghanistan, for example, to pandemic actual modeling, to modeling the role of religion in the White House by the British Cabinet Office. There are many, many examples of its use, and a considerable number of them in Singapore. So what I want to finish off is to give you a high-level overview of the new handbook we're producing with the Policy Lab in the EU Commission on how to manage in chaos. This is a joint production of the Cynefin Centre, which I run Yeah, and the policy lab. And basically, I want to do this in 2 slides and then I'll finish. Firstly, there are 5 steps if you're in that central AC confused domain. Yeah, you don't know what the hell to do. Everything's gone wrong. It may be chaos. It may be confused. Doesn't matter too much. You know, you're in the same space. So 5 key things you do. First of all, you immediately impose some type of constraint to give yourself breathing space. If you look at what the New Zealand Prime Minister did, she just closed the boundaries immediately. She didn't wait until she had to. Right? Now, she could have got that right or she could have got it wrong, but actually it was a sensible move because it gave space for new things to develop. So the radical and draconian imposition of constraints is one of the first things you do in a crisis. And you try and do them in such a way that you keep open as many possibilities as you can. After you've done that, and this is a key principle which isn't on the slide, the center coordinates, but you distribute decision making. You can't make decisions in the center because your role is to observe and coordinate and prompt, not to make the decisions. Yeah, that also increases confidence, to be honest. You make this initial set of constraint stuff, and then you open up. Second thing, question to ask. Did you ignore expert advice? Did you have medical people or epidemiologists who understood what was going to happen, who've been screaming at you for years and you forgot about it, or you didn't want to hear it? Right, call them in, apologize, and give them some resource. That's kind of like step number 2. Step number 3, you've got conflict between experts, like the conflict between behavioral economists and epidemiologists. Right, force them into a competitive environment with other observers and see how they manage. Don't get involved in making the decision yourself. Get them to actually compete in a staged environment with other scientific observers from different backgrounds and see who wins and who loses, or who partially wins and who partially loses, and allocate your resource accordingly. So that's kind of like stage 3. Stage 4, where you've got coherent hypotheses, start the experiments. We don't know what type of vaccine will work, so there are hundreds of people trying different approaches to vaccines around the world, and we'll find out what works or doesn't work in what ethnic groups later. You can't afford to do a one-horse bet. Yeah, you've actually got to bet on multiple horses in parallel, where you've got some sort of coherent hypothesis. And then you need to create what are called human sensor networks. That's your employees, your customers, academics, people from multiple different backgrounds who can do assessment for you in parallel. Now, this is called wisdom of crowds in the popular literature. So I'll give you one of the famous examples on that. A US submarine grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1960s. Nobody knew where it was. So they gave different groups of estimates, the available different groups of experts, partial access to the data, got them all to estimate the position. Yeah. And nobody got it right, but a probability distribution of all of the estimates was within 600 meters of the submarine. Now, there are sound statistical and cognitive reasons why that works, but by deploying the whole of your workforce in real time to do quantitative assessment of real-time data, you actually find the 17%, you find the patterns, you see things that you couldn't see as an individual. So creating and using that is key. And then finally, I say nullify, that's a nice ambiguous word. Yeah, the process freaks who are saying this would have never happened if we followed project management protocols, or it would never happen if. Get rid of those guys. Yeah, what they're trying to do is to create order where order isn't possible. So those are the kind of like basic steps, coherence. And the way to manage through a crisis, so I've gone from a turbulent stream to a rather nice river in Yellowstone. 4 steps. First of all, assess. Now, in the assessment stage, you ask yourself 3 questions. Was the crisis we're in possible, plausible, or do we have a plan? And if the answer to any of that is no, then you're in a crisis, a real crisis. Yeah, if it was possible or plausible and you have a plan, just implement it. It's not a major crisis. You don't go into the big steps. If it is a crisis, then you have to adapt very quickly. And the first thing you do is to map the constraints. What are the things which are contained in behavior? What are the things which you can manage yeah, from which emergence and other patterns will happen. So constraint mapping is a key capability. It's an established process. It's fairly easy to do. And by changing constraints, you can allow different patterns. So making a fixed constraint permeable, letting some things through, or making a permeable constraint fixed. Those are examples of actual change. Next, you execute the 5 steps that I mentioned earlier. You've got to create coherence fast. This is part of the adaptation phase. Third, you need to reorganize fast. You can't have hierarchies in a crisis. And basically, you organize people into groups of 5, 15, 150 with overlapping membership. There's sound science behind these, by the way. 5 is a cognitive limit, 15 is a trust limit, 150 is an acquaintanceship limit. So small things can combine and recombine very quickly. And the other thing you also do on this is to start to actively manage your informal networks, because informal networks have trust and transparency built into them, while formal systems don't. So changing the organizational unit so you're adaptive. And by the way, communication works like this as well. Twitter is more effective than an academic paper, i.e. short, compact bits of information work better. You then need to start learning. This is the thing everybody gets wrong. We've got programs running on this in the NHS at the moment. National Audit Office of Wales have redeployed their entire audit staff to capture lessons learned during the crisis, because you don't want to do this afterwards. Yeah, lessons learned at the time are critical. You must initiate learning from the moment the crisis starts and have dedicated teams for that. Because after the event, politics and hindsight will come into play. And you need to engage the staff, not communicate to them. Remember I talked earlier about using the whole of your workforce to do situational assessment? By getting people involved in understanding the problem, in creating scenarios about the future, you communicate far more actively because you make them active participants in the problem rather than passive recipients of the leader's wisdom. So that's communicate by engagement is key. That shifts you into the XAP phase. You need to set up a special unit to focus on unintended consequences. In a small company, it might be one person, but this is dedicated. The only thing I know for certain about a complex adaptive system is that whatever you do will have unintended consequences. So you need a group who model that and respond to it, because actually these are opportunities as well as threats. And that's part of the way we accept. The informal network again. A famous statement by Hewlett-Packard, the CEO, if only Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knew. The famous unknown unknowns phrase is also the things we know that we're not aware of. That's the most scary thing. So your informal networks will have solutions to problems which you can access in real time. It's not just the formal systems. And then this concept of radical repurposing, you're actively focusing on new opportunities. So what are the things which are emerging as a result of this crisis, where we could do what IBM did and take our punch card technology and get the first foothold in computer science? And that's me using a specific example. That's the big opportunity. What's going to happen to the hospitality industry with social distancing? What opportunities does that present to do something radically differently, for example? And then from that, we transcend. We need to ritualize the endpoint. If people have gone through a tragedy, there needs to be a ritual, an act of transition by which they can celebrate and mourn and all those sort of things. And then the key thing is you start to train for the next crisis now, while it's fresh in people's memory. Human-mediated games, anthrosimulation, which we pioneered with the Singapore Armed Forces, are human-mediated game environments in which everybody fails. And of course, you learn more from failure than you learn from success. So building, training, learning for the next crisis into the process is there. And then you need to find the anticipatory thinkers. Now, this is a criteria of people who are important. They're people who think forwards instinctively. And my favorite illustration of this is a source of deep personal frustration, is how to pack a dishwasher. I know this sounds mundane, but some people just put things in the dishwasher so they're constantly having to be moved around to fit everything else in. Other people think through what's going into the dishwasher that day and position things in an anticipatory way so you only place things once. Now, just think about that one, because anticipatory thinkers often we don't develop within leaders. And then you've got a real opportunity to create a radical new organization now. Yeah, you don't need to go back to the old ways of doing things. The NHS in the UK is broken bureaucracy. Things which used to take 3 weeks now take less than a day, and with no reduction in safety. You want to carry through those practices because they'll make you a more attractive organization to work for. So that's a sort of high level picture. Yeah, I've tried to give you the 3 sciences which are key: complexity, acceptation, inattentional blindness, Cynefin framework, and then giving you the sort of bare bones of what is being written up in detail, hopefully for publication next week, which is the EU field book on how to manage a crisis. And at the end of it, kind of like, we can create structures. You can see them in this picture. Even in turbulence, human beings can create a degree of order. Your role as a leader is to give that structure without destroying the flow. Not to be draconian, but to be co-evolutionary, to actually ride a horse rather than manage a household budget. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dave. That was really, really interesting, fascinating. I would now like to extend a huge and very warm welcome once again to our distinguished guest panelists who have been sitting so patiently and taking in and digesting all that Dave has been saying. Deepak Ohri is an award-winning entrepreneur, business leader, public speaker, guest lecturer, and mentor. His groundbreaking work on sustainable financial growth models for the luxury and hospitality industries have been employed by many establishments as gold standard. Jesko van den Steinen, he is consulting as the lead facilitator for the Difference, a complex problem solution hub, for experience consulting with PwC, China and Hong Kong. Jesko also works with Cognitive Edge as a certified trainer, helping organizations understand how to absorb uncertainty, create resilience, and develop weak signal detection using insights from complex adaptive systems. Multi-talented, Jesko was also formerly the principal solo artist with Cirque du Soleil and co-creator of the world's largest water-based show. And last but not least, Tong Yi. He's the co-founder and director of the Thought Collective, one of Singapore's largest group of social enterprises that focuses on building social and emotional capital in Singapore. He's also the executive director of Common Ground, a new civic facility that seeks to facilitate and the critical partnerships between people, public, and private sectors. His bodies of work span across creating sustainable community space, experience design, curriculum design, narrative crafting, and intervention. So right to start off, panelists, what are some of your initial thoughts and reactions to what Dave presented, and how is the Cynefin framework applicable to what you're doing? Perhaps we can start with Jesko. You're working in Hong Kong. How is the Cynefin framework applicable to what you see and what you do?
Well, obviously, it's Hong Kong is quite turbulent at the moment, not just with COVID, but of course politically. And the work that I've been doing is helping organizations. How do they create coherence in a time of chaos? And if they have a future vision, how do they not take a classic consulting approach to it, which is basically a seven-step solution that they think they can apply in any context? And how can we perhaps take a vector-based approach, which is that we're managing direction and speed. And we are wide enough in our perspective that we're not necessarily goal-based. If we're goal-based, then we don't see the potentials for innovation. And I think this is something that Dave has spoken about a lot, and I'm somewhat parroting his comments, of course butchering them. But the point is that if we are goal-based and we say we need to get out of COVID, we need to reach certain targets, you do not have the space for opportunities that present themselves as novel. And to give a contra point of view that's perhaps more metaphoric than actually specific. When I was working with Cirque du Soleil, for example, or performing in theater, is that we would often take shallow dives into chaos and see what would happen. And this happened in many ways, was trying to mash different ideas together, take different risks, and we would observe to see what would emerge. And it's by being open enough, not trying to get a finite result, that sometimes a new result would come out. And the way that we are doing this with organizations is that if there is a crisis management team, then one of the things that I insist upon, and I'm starting to insist more upon, is that at the same time, you have a team working and observing for opportunities and innovations, for how to change and different ways of working. And being in Macau right now, we see this same thing happening with hotels. And I think Deepak can probably speak to it a bit better than I can, so I'll leave that to him. But to answer the question, perhaps a bit tightly, one thing that we are doing in Hong Kong, that I'm working with organizations is in Hong Kong, where do we put our attention and where do we put our resources? Some things are obvious or they're clear, just do them. Don't worry, pay attention, just do them. Some things we just need to give to the experts, give them 3 days, let them come back to us with a finite answer if we think that it's a situation that has a finite answer. Things that are really crazy, then we just need to do something. We need to act, sense, and then respond. And then if there are multiple possibilities, there's no point of arguing. Create multiple experiments that are safe to fail. So finite amount of money. And if we know how we're going, if we know what the answer is, how do we augment it? And if it goes wrong, how do we take it down, right? This is what Dave spoke about earlier, and do them in parallel. Now there's more to that, and how exactly you do that, but then the right answer emerges. And once we see that and we can repeat it and get the same result, then we can push it across into the expert zone. So that is a way for, as a strategic leadership, we can look at where we put our resources and our attention. And remember, Cynefin is not a categorization network exclusively. It can be, but it's not exclusively that. Fundamentally, it's a framework and a way of looking at things. And if we use that as a way of looking at things, we know then we can see how we potentially organize ourselves around it. So I think that is fair enough now as an answer to a question. But I'll close again and saying with Hong Kong, it's a very challenging time, especially politically, and there's a lot going on, and I don't feel that I'm the best person to unpack that.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah. Deepak, the COVID-19 pandemic is having a devastating impact on the hospitality sector, and it's hit the hotel industry particularly hard. How might the Cynefin framework prepare the hospitality, tourism, and travel industry for the long recovery ahead?
Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. I got introduced to Cynefin framework when I spoke to you. I accept I didn't know about this, but I found it very interesting. And why I found it very interesting is we started our organization in year 2003, and we were the first person we hired, actually second person we hired was an anthropologist. We call ourselves in a hospitality space, but we always go through evolving consumer journey. Now coming to that how industry has been affected, I don't have to magnify that. We all know how badly we are affected. But why we got affected is what I want to speak. What I liked about Cynefin framework was the obvious, complicated, complex, and chaotic. I think what happened with COVID-19 was known. But how did we go to the next framework of Cynefin was we made it unknown. How we made it unknown is we never learned from our previous experiences, I would say that. So I'm not saying that, as Dave mentioned, in hindsight, anybody can be a genius. When Ebola happened, all the big data scientists, they were proved wrong. Because when it happened in Sierra Leone, they were tracking the movement of people with the mobile phones. But again, it comes to behavior. People there do not carry mobile phones with them. How it became an epidemic, not a pandemic because it was contained, was at the funerals. So what we did here is we believed in, again, these data, and data again were proved wrong. What it created and what pandemic does, and I will quote Gillian Tett, who's a Financial Times US editor, what pandemic does is, yes, more than the spread of the disease, it creates a fear in people's mind. And what has happened today is a fear in people's mind. Now the question was, a month back, we were all talking about a lot of restrictions, social distancing, staying at home, locking down the country. As Dave mentioned, that New Zealand Prime Minister did the right thing, though I may have a very different opinion to that. All these things were done keeping in mind the vaccine will come. The question today is, what if we do not get the vaccine? What is the new way of life? The new way of life would be that we have to remove the fear out of people's mind. Like Oscar, who's the United Airlines CEO, he mentioned in one of the Bloomberg interviews, when he was asked, are you going to keep the middle seat empty? And he mentioned that, when we are 70% full, we tell the customers, you want to take any other flight or you want to go in this flight? The customer, he chooses. He didn't say social distancing is must to curb the disease. He said it is the fear which is in people's mind. So I think this fear that we have created, and not many organizations, not many people are talking about it in removing that fear. What has happened also in hospitality industry is how we created more fear. We started firing people. Suddenly a new word for all public sector companies in hospitality, I won't name, has come. We are making our organization more efficient. And what they did was, by making it more efficient, somebody is saying 20% of workforce, somebody is firing 30% of workforce, a shareholder, and they're doing it for the shareholders. They're doing it for their stock prices. A question these shareholders should ask, I've been buying your stock for the last 50 years. Why your organization was not efficient at that point of time, and why suddenly you need a pandemic to come to make this more efficient? We at Labua, we are a small company. We have 1,500 people, and we are almost 3 months into pandemic because we were the second or third country to get that. We were at epidemic at that point of time. So 3 months into COVID-19, we have not even fired a single employee. Our balance sheet is small. We don't have a public who's supporting us because we are not a public listed company. The point is, we want to go back to our customer in luxury space and tell them that you have to come out of your fear. And how do we go and tell them today to come out of the fear when we ourselves are firing people and creating that fear? So there is one thing which is the social distancing. Now, I won't name the countries, but I will tell you, is the one country which went into a lockdown. They said, we have seen the data. We are going with this data. They had 5,000 cases in that country. They went for a lockdown. Huge country. Now, this country, sadly enough, has got 6,000 cases on daily basis, and they have opened up. So, why they have opened up? Because suddenly we were very bullish that the vaccine will come. We are still bullish. I hope the vaccine will come. But the point is, what if the vaccine don't come? I was part of one very famous tourism organization. I'm giving you my personal experience. And they had to do their worldwide conference in a month of April. And I wrote to them in Feb. I spoke to them in Feb. And they said, you know what? This is something which is only in Asia, like SARS, and it's not going to come to this part of the world. I ended up resigning from that organization in month of March, again, protesting that why they are doing huge and large gatherings. So in hospitality space, we have to contain, but we don't have to finish the industry. We don't have to aggravate the fear. We have to go back, and I love this framework. I'm going to go much deeper and nosedive and understand that we need to work with the knowns. And suddenly when what it needs in one sentence, we need the big data scientist, but what it needs is a blend of data with the person-to-person contact. If I have to put what I just said in one line, and not only the hospitality industry will come up, but I think many countries will learn from this and will realize that whatever has happened shouldn't have happened, but it's never late. I think we should relook at it, we should redefine where we are, and we should take certain extremes, because data is also very cultural, very regional, very local. Data cannot be taken that what is happening in Singapore is going to happen, because consumer behavior are very different.
Right. Deepak,
So,
thank you
that is
so
my-
much for that. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and certainly some very, very valid points made there about data and fear. Tony, could you give us a Singapore perspective?
Sure. First of all, just let me take the opportunity to thank Dave for his work in Singapore. The civil society actually has benefited quite a bit actually from the work that you've done with the civil service, and it's cascaded quite effectively down throughout multiple other communities throughout the country. So thank you for that. And Natasha, thank you for the invite. I think the main thing that we're focusing on right now, especially as far as the Singapore social sector is concerned, is we really are trying to look at more at the long term, or what David maybe say about the anticipatory work that needs to be done. We're concerned about the crisis as far as COVID-19 is concerned is so highly disruptive that we're missing the data as to what really could be happening for people. So there's quite a bit of work right now where we're looking at what is emerging or how the system has evolved or changed as a result of that. So I wanted to take the opportunity to quickly share some of the work that Dave's work within Singapore has sort of like evolved into as far as like Singapore is concerned. So I was going to quickly just share some slides, and I'm going to jump back into this and give it back to Dave. Yeah. So we were very taken by the amount of diversity that was moving out in Singapore, and we found itself that if we wanted to translate a lot, maybe the work itself within the Cynefin model into a human language that people could necessarily latch onto and things like that. We asked the questions on what do you want and can you get there? And we found that within the social sector, a lot of these two questions were driving a lot of emotional movements, driving anxiety, driving all sorts of behavior, right, around determining what people want and determining the strategy of whether they could get what they want. And what's fascinating over here is that we began to see that the complexity really began when we asked the question and switched it into what do we want in Singapore and can we get there? And the two things itself in trends that were evolving within Singapore was the huge diversity that was growing up extremely quickly, and as well as basically the fact that Singapore is still scarcity short. It's still a resource short, and this whole psychology of scarcity is still very much within our own domains. So when it came down to agreement and certainty, I think some people have begun to read, or at least find ways to reconfigure agreement and certainty into diagrams like this, right? Where we're looking at this and understanding basically how broader trends like media proliferation, diversity in context, unequal distribution of incomes, and things like that were really pushing out these two lines of agreement and certainty. So what we've done in the civil society is really begin to work through what are the modes of engagement. This is a collaboration continuum. Some of the other OD consultants over here have been working out these ideas. And I guess some people have begun to overlay the idea that if we are in simple or complicated, complex and chaotic, what are the modes of engagement that we can therefore operate in terms of when we're engaging together with other people? And what we began to see over here is that Singapore, being as top-down as it was, largely was based on strong institutions, right? And in the institutions, there was a lot of telling and selling. And even though there's a lot of talk in Singapore about co-creation, fundamentally it's still them testing ideas, and the power has not necessarily shifted in the modalities of the conversations. So within the chaos, there's still a lot of attempt at telling on selling. Whereas by right over here, we should be really looking at creating new movements where we can get data, see what is emergent, and co-create together with the people there. So obviously in panic right now, institutions are king, and people are leaning towards those particular systems. But civil society is trying as much as possible to balance this with models of convening and co-creating so that we can get the evolving models going on in the country. So this is largely how we began to apply it. I think it's still a typology right now where we're not certain whether these really map so neatly as we're are looking at here. But I think we're really keen to experiment, to test, and grateful for the work, right, that Dave has brought into Singapore. So I'll stop there and I'll bring it back to Natasha and Dave. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Dave, would you like to rejoin us and let us know your views on the reflections that you've heard?
Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think several comments. I actually posted on the link something I wrote recently about big data. This is kind of like in support of Deepak. You've got, there's an interesting paper by a group of epidemiologists who are basically screaming blue murder at people like Taleb and the like, who just think because they've got some algorithms and some access to public data, they can tell everybody what to do. But they don't understand the basic factors of how disease spreads. Yeah. And the same would be true. A lot of the behavioral economists are also big data guys rather than true cognitive scientists. So you get that. And the funeral example is a really good one on COVID. So one of the things I've said, I'd say I put the link up, big data is fine, but it requires very, very high volume and you are at high vulnerability. Like all the disease vector models, if you've made a wrong assumption. In fact, some of the models, like the Imperial model, don't produce the same data even when they're run with the same starting points. So you've got to be very, very cautious on big data. Yeah? And big data is profoundly influenced by the training data sets used, and people don't pay enough attention to that in AI. You've then got thick data, which is the classic ethnography anthropologists, and anthropologists are a neglected discipline. But that doesn't scale at volume. Yeah, the work we do, which I call rich data, and I couldn't resist calling the blog Big, Thick and Rich because I was having to read Trump's tweets at the time, so the two associated themselves, all right? And I don't apologize for that. Rich data is where you actually get people to self-interpret their own experience. So you create quantitative data by mass participation rather than by the inhuman application of data algorithms. And that's what I've been talking about in things like mass sense and distribution. So that's the communication by engagement, right? I think there are dangers on the fear side. So I just agreed with Deepak on one thing. I'm going to express a concern on the other. We don't know enough about this disease yet. It is killing people in ways that we didn't expect with long-term health effects. Yeah, it's actually doing that. Diversity doesn't match the low rate of mutation, which is causing concern. There's considerable evidence it spreads on pollution particles. Yeah, there's evidence that it actually operates with DNA in a different way from anything we've seen before, and we now know that there are super transmitters. So typhoid Marys, there are some people who act as super transmitters and some people who don't transmit it at all. All right, which means the R factor is kind of like too crude a measure. So there are so many unknowns at the moment, yeah, that we got a big problem, yeah, in the way that we really relax material, yeah. So social distancing, I think it's the wrong phrase. It's physical distancing, yeah. We should start to talk about whether social distancing was the wrong thing. Our village is quite fun. I mean, tonight at 8 o'clock, we all go out to clap the health service, which personally, I think most of them would prefer us to stop doing. But from a village point of view, it means we all stand out our houses and we have chats and we compete as to who's got the largest, glass of gin and tonic. And there's, and then the next night we all sit outside our houses. So there's village communication on, which didn't go on before. And there's collaboration and participation, which didn't go on before. And those are some, and I think that's where the fear goes away. It's to actually the ability for people to lead some ordinary life. And Deepak is completely correct on the financial side. You can't expect people to socially isolate if and this was the Indian catastrophe, people had to choose between starvation and compliance. And under those circumstances, you don't comply because you're not going to starve. So the universal minimum wage, the safety net, all those sort of things start to come into play in terms of fear reduction. And then you've got the issue about travel. So, if we look at the way travel bubbles are building, it's quite likely there'll be Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, China, North Korea, sort of you can travel within that restriction. But from outside, you'll be subject to some sort of quarantine. So I think it's quite likely, given the way the US is going at the moment, that they're effectively running up the equivalent of the yellow flag that ship used to put up, you know, when they came into harbor to say we've got plague, and nobody went near to them until it was over. So I can see there being travel restrictions imposed on countries who don't actually get the thing under control. And that was my earlier point about some countries are going to come through this in a better position. Yeah? So that would be a general set of comments. Yeah. I would be slightly concerned about the use of the Stacey matrix, and I understand why Tong Yi's doing that, but I would be concerned about that because it over-focuses on human interpretation of the data rather than the real data. But I've written about that and I'll send the link. And it also tends to, it misses the point that in human systems, we can create order. If you look at Ralph's work, it fundamentally assumes everything is complex. What Cynefin says is actually human beings have learned to actually remove complexity. We've learned to create order and structure. Yeah, and therefore it shouldn't be represented as a continuum. Yeah. Language is key. That's why I made the physical distance, not social distancing point. I mean, Heidegger famously said, man thinks he's the master of language, but language is the master of man. So the language you use to describe something is critical. Yeah? And one of the interesting things, and this came through from several of the respondents, is the attitude to science. So we've had scientists have been, you know, basically condemned to the outer darkness in some countries. And I won't say where, but I was working with an Ebola management team and told I couldn't mention evolution because it was a controversial theory. So if you can't mention evolution to an Ebola management team, the world is in a very bad place in terms of its understanding of science, because Ebola is moving into symbiote stage. It's not killing everybody anymore, which means it's far more dangerous than when it killed everybody, yeah, in terms of transmission. So I think one of the big what if questions, and I think this is a responsibility of governments, is how we start to show respect for science while allowing science to be transparent about the fact it doesn't know everything. Because what happens is the minute the scientists admit some failure, everybody goes into the conspiracy theories, any theory is as good as this, yeah? You got the massive destruction of trust. I mean, we got that in the UK at the moment, yeah, with the hypocritical behavior of government advisors, yeah, not obeying their own rules. And if you lose trust in your leadership, everything else fails. So one of the fascinating things is how do you balance trust and transparency? If you're transparent, you're going to have to admit to failure. And that may destroy trust. And that's one of the things we need to start working out, because the science on this is incomplete. I think the other thing, and this is something I've talked a lot about with Peter Ho in Singapore over the years, in fact, I'm on a call with him after this, right? Which is we've lost generalists in society. And this is kind of like a key message for leadership, right? What we got is nothing but specialists. So we haven't got people who can do the integration. Yeah, we got behavioral scientists who believe in behavioral science. We've got epidemiologists. We've got, you know, geneticists. They all sit in their silos, and there are very few people who have the mental compass to integrate those different disciplines. And the education system stopped producing generalists about 30, 40 years ago in terms of the way it worked. Now, in a crisis of this nature, we need leaders who are transdisciplinary. You need leaders who can be informed by science, but also have real world experience. You need leaders who can take things from different disciplines and integrate them. And we need some very rapid training in that field, because we've got very few generalists left. And that would be kind of like the message to leave you with, I think. Not sure I just everything, but that was an immediate response. Yeah. Oh, and just in response to Garrett Weiner, right, so I'll answer that live. Nora and I get on really well. We've discovered we dislike all the same people. There's nothing like disliking all the same people to form a bond. Warm data and rich data are similar. The difference is rich data is quantitative and scales, whereas warm data is qualitative and doesn't scale, but the principle is the same. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Dave. So for those of you who are not aware, there's been very active question and answer going on in the background, and we would like for you to continue posting your questions. And even though we're not able to answer and attend to everyone's questions, we will definitely attempt to answer them by posting post-webinar readings on our LinkedIn page in the coming days, because there's loads of information and valuable and rich information that we can put out there. There's one question that we'd like to pose, and we wonder what the panel, Dave included, thinks about ethics in this time of crisis. As we see a rise of innovative services and products, for example, tracking services, that could be a gain to tackle this pandemic and a pain to the privacy of the individual.
Well, I can say that from China, we're seeing considerable amount of opportunism that's gravitating towards authoritarianism. And what is perhaps has a humanist start very quickly can devolve. And I think that we need to be very mindful as a society. How do we embrace these things? And we shouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction either way. And I believe that the one way that we can do this is by holding one another to account, and that we have an individual responsibility as well as a collective responsibility. And I think Dave could probably talk to this a bit interestingly around social atomization and communitarian cultures. And there's perhaps a way of discussing, of framing that point of view.
Warren Buffett said it, that when the tide will go down, we'll see what everyone is wearing. I'll give you certain examples from 4 different continents. One continent, a very great group, gave a lot of money in millions of dollars for charity. In a week later, they got a lot of their employees out. There's the old saying, charity begins at home. Okay, that is one part of the ethics. In US, the governments are given PPP, personal payroll protection, but still there are people who are gone on furloughs and everything. So I think what the world should see now, and maybe we should take this pandemic as a lesson, there should be a stronger public sector and private sector partnership or collaboration. Because no government alone can solve this crisis, no organization alone can solve this crisis. I think the time has come to join hands rather than criticizing. There's enough time to criticize once the pandemic is over, at a hindsight, like Dave has said, but at this point of time, what we need is everyone to work together, including the media. And we can always go back later and say that this was not right or that was not right, but the time is, the crisis is at hand. It needs to be solved. It needs to see stronger partnerships. It needs to see a lot of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Just to throw something in on here, I mean, I think Jessica made the point about that there's a major divide in political philosophy between what's called social atomism and communitarianism. So social atomism dominates Northern Europe and North America, and to some extent Singapore now. It's the belief that society is an aggregation of individual self-interest, and from that you get rights and duties and the social contract and everything else. Communitarianism, which dominates Africa, Asia, Latin America, Southern Europe, and the Celtic fringe of the British Isles, is tribal and says people are defined by the tribe they belong to and the social interactions. Okay? And therefore the individual is less important than the group. And you know, there's been religious wars fought over this over the years for centuries, all right? More people have died over that distinction than anything else in human thinking. I think one of the things we're facing at the moment, and I said this on several conferences, that COVID is God's gift to humanity, because it's a chance to wake up, because there are far worse things coming than COVID. You know, we could get another pandemic in which there's not, you need an 8-week, for example, isolation period, not a 2-week. Yeah, and at that point, the R factor just goes out this roof, right? And we got global warming. Yeah. We might end up all actually in socially isolated in air-conditioned environments for 2 or 3 hours a day. I mean, this is where Singapore are going to face this. You know, within a few decades in Singapore and Malaysia and parts of Saudi Arabia, there'll be 3 or 4 hours of the day where you can only survive in air conditioning because it would be too hot otherwise. So the sort of crisis, this COVID is a real opportunity for us to actually seize the day. And we need to start to bring back in some older religious concepts. Terry Eagleton, who's a brilliant writer, recently wrote a book called Radical Sacrifice. Because there's no way you come out of something like COVID, or we actually manage global warming, without the concept of sacrifice. And that's a communitarian concept, but it's not an atomistic concept. So if you think everything is about you, then sacrifice is something you only do if you really have to, but you avoid it, or you only do it in a kinship group. Yeah, and the sort of issue, and it's a genuine dilemma that we're not thinking about, is you actually, increase the number of deaths in order to keep the economy going, because that's the choice. Yeah, are the deaths which are consequence on poverty from the lack of economy going, that's all a big factor. And so one of the things I think government should be looking at is, first of all, is there something out of this which gives us a procedure we can follow or a way of thinking? But also we need to rethink the way economies work. I mean, the current economic system, has sort of grown out of the sort of neoliberal type concept, and most behavioral science is a justification of that. We now know that money isn't necessarily a restriction. If you look into indigenous communities, or you look into local communities like my village in Wiltshire, gifting is actually more effective than using money as a rationing device. And gifting is an entry fee. I mean, in theory, there's no reason why we shouldn't give free at the point of entry healthcare and education to everybody in the world. But we choose to ration it with money, and ration training with money. I mean, we could train far more people than we do. And I think states which start to rethink that will become more attractive and more resilient in the face of uncertainty. States which perpetuate with the old economic models based on selfishness are going to collapse because they're not going to be able to cope. Yeah, and I think this is where some of the, it's why I've always, in the States argued that Singapore is not a totalitarian state, it's a democracy. But it's a democracy within constraints. Lee Kuan Yew was a socialist, he always was a socialist. The housing policy was brilliant. Yeah, because it forced, we're going to have to rethink the way society works in order to handle a resource constraint world, because free market capitalism arose on the back of the assumption there were infinitely available resources, and there aren't anymore. Not only that, but those resources are at threat, so we're going to have to rethink it. But we don't want to go down the absolute control route of the Chinese, because the Chinese have forgotten. Chinese stability was based on a contrast between Confucianism and Taoism, between heuristics and rules. And kind of like the current Chinese regime is all about the rules, and they've forgotten the heuristics. And that's where the humanity comes in.
Thank you for that, Dave. And this actually brings me to a point. I've just been reading about Simon Sinek and his new book called The Infinite Game, and there's some of those themes that you just mentioned that were echoed there. I think we have time for maybe one last question, and would be to ask, okay, there's a global push for organizations to use agile methodology. Do you believe, for example, agile frameworks, Scrum, Lean, Kanban, are being used effectively in organizations?
I can answer that one if you want. Agile is the latest hype, right? And you can tell it's reaching the end of its hype because you've got total nonsense like SAFe, which is the complete commoditization of Agile into a highly structured process with no degrees of freedom. Agile started off as an idea to allow a degree of liberation. It was always a partial solution. There's nothing wrong with waterfall development. Big companies have always been Agile. You can see people trying to say that, the big tech companies work because they're Agile. Actually, they're not particularly. They were just the first into their market and they dominated. So they don't have to be very efficient, right? So Agile for me is useful, but it's another hyped approach. And we've got to stop going with management fads and stop going with hype methods based on cheap books thrown together with retrospective coherence against partial understanding of case studies. And we've got to get into stuff which is based on real science and real research, on a sustainable basis and a resilient basis, because the hype cycle is going to destroy companies. Sorry, I feel mildly.
I can add a little bit of color. Some of the work around Cynefin that Dave has been doing is around the liminal space, and that's between the phase shift between, say, one domain of complex pushing over to other domains. And I think the thing that Dave has often said that I've picked up on is that in some contexts, a waterfall approach is appropriate. In some contexts, using an agile approach could be appropriate. And this fad methodology, this fad behavior is the assumption that agile is appropriate to all contexts. Agile HR, agile this, agile that. And I think we need to step back and look at it and say which tool for when, which horse for which course. And I think that this would be, and I'm building on what Dave is saying, is that in the liminal phase, there may be an appropriate use of Scrum to move from a complex domain to get repeatable results into a complicated domain. And vice versa, as we push down to other domains is clear. But there is, I think, a lot of money being made by a lot of consultants by trying to push the latest fad. And this is where I would scale back and say that even in my world as a consultant today or performing, not every joke works for every audience. If I'm performing in Asia, making fun of the older person, which is very common in Europe, doesn't work. You have to adapt and use a different tool. So a very classic story is we were doing this piece and we're performing in Korea, and there's a moment where the high status character gets hit in the face. It's a comedic element. It would kill in Europe, it would be funny. As soon as we did it in Asia, silence, crickets, nothing. And as what's going on? And we've had to adapt quickly. And that's, I think, this problem that just to use one common language that's current and try to adapt it in all situations doesn't work. You have to adapt to the context. And I think that's where a typology like Cynefin can be very useful.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm afraid that we'll have to bring a close to our session because it's 8 minutes to 5 o'clock. It's been very, very engaging. Everyone's participated, from the chat group to our panelists to Dave. Thank you so much. Just gonna have a few closing remarks to say here. This webinar series could not have been possible without our partners, The Edge, KBI Soft, IDC, the Social Capital Institute, and SB Jain School of Business Management. So thank you for your support. And just to let you know, our media partner, The Edge, will do a roundup coverage at the end of the 4-part series, which will be a week after the 9th of July. And this write-up will be published in print as well as online. So Dave, thank you once again for taking us through so much fascinating information and for generating all this wonderful discourse, which is, I think, certainly relevant today. Also really sorry to hear about your medical ordeal and hope that you're feeling better. Okay, I think we're definitely not going back to normal, and we should take this opportunity to hit the reset and learn valuable lessons and rethink everything from leadership to democracy to work to relationships, identity and meaning. And there will be no end to this crisis, really. We're in it, and it's become the next normal. Thank you, Deepak, Yasko, and Tongi. You were amazing.
Thank you.
Your time so generously. Lastly, Dave and Cognitive Edge have been really generous to offer us all an opportunity to try out the SenseMaker tool. So scan this QR code to try it out. And the SenseMaker is the world's first crowdsourcing method for human judgment, meaning, and feeling. It enables the capture of the experiences from real people when they matter the most, ensuring that quantitative data always has the meaning and context of qualitative narratives. So please take a moment to scan this code and complete the questionnaire. It's a very short one after the webinar. So we've come very close to the end of this session. Last but not least, again, a huge thank you for all of you for joining in. It's amazing. It would not have been possible. And I was just amazed that there are people from Brazil with, at 4 o'clock in the morning all the way to Australia at 7:30 p.m. at night. So it's been a wonderful turnout. We're very humbled and truly appreciative for you to join us. This is the first in a series of 4, so please join us for the next, and you can register. And just a few quick takeaways. We hope that was enlightening, that this session was enlightening. And I think a few of the key takeaways would be that data is one of them. So it is important to integrate the human cognition and human sense making into decisions. Big data is not enough. And the second is the concept of expertise, right? And how expertise in crisis is not enough. We need to stimulate more cross-domain, cross-expertise conversations so that we don't fall into this expert trap, right? And more generalists and integrators are needed. Okay. So with that, I will say goodbye to everybody. Thank you once again. See you in the next webinar on the 11th of June on leading the future of work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.